Okay, you are Jeff Kirkham, and I wanted to thank you for joining me today and apologize to you in person for getting the story of the rat's tourniquet wrong and saying a bunch of shit that I shouldn't have said. And so I'm genuinely sorry, and I thank you for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And it's like that's very, very cool of you to do that. It's very cool. That's right in my philosophy of life is when we make mistakes or bumbles or whatever, we have that accountability that's there
Well,
and
several people from your previous community, Green Berets, reached out to me and were like, "Hey, you've got it wrong. That's not the story of the rats, and you need to get the story straight." I was like, "Tracking, thank you." And so there was external pressure that produced accountability in order for us to have this conversation. But when you make a mistake, admit it, right? And I did. And so uh, I thank you for your time. And you're a super interesting dude. I didn't know a whole lot about you until I listened to the Black Rifle Coffee podcast with Evan that you put me on to. And 29 years in the Army and DEA and PhD in nursing, and you've wrote a
and
bunch of books.
masters in nursing. Don't have my PhD yet.
Masters. Okay.
I'm I'll get there one of these days, but yeah, a master's. Yeah.
Yet. And I love that approach to life. Yet, not a master yet. Um, and you've wrote some books. I think they had something to do with that movie Homestead that recently came out.
Yeah, so Homestead is based off of the Black Autumn series that myself and Jason wrote.
That's brilliant. And I'm specifically intrigued by the retreats that we spoke on the phone. And you said you're doing these retreats with veterans and first responders or to help them kind of like a whole of person healing process. And I think that's wonderful. So what does that look like? What do you guys do?
It's actually so it's Mustang medicine is where we do that under. We actually do a variety of things, but kind of the pinnacle experience that we do is a 3.5 day immersive retreat that we call Mustang Medicine, the Rewilding. There's kind of a story behind the whole term rewilding, and what we do is we help people we teach them tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs, whatever you want to call it, tools to regulate their nervous system. And part of that is understanding self. And it's a very gentle experience. A lot of people are like, "Oh, Jeff the Green Beret, is this going to be, some selection process?" And it's a 180 off of that. I firmly believe that unless you have that an internal epiphanal moment, the proverbial take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I can dunk your head in the water and it's not going to do anything. And so personal sovereignty is the pinnacle of what we teach. And so people opting in to look at self and be self-contemplative and working with other folks that are there. And so we have we balance the IQ, the EQ, and the SQ. So the intelligence, the emotional, and the social. And so we teach classes. So we'll do something like we do cold plunges. We don't do cold plunges because they're the latest craze on Instagram. We do cold plunges because there's a physical, psychological, and emotional reason as to why they are such a phenomenal way of learning how to regulate the nervous system and then building in community that adds to that EQ, that emotional content to it. And we've just seen great success. We get everything from CEOs to sales teams to veterans to soccer moms and we weave all these folks together because I think for veterans, and I can say this too, is we tend to think we've got a corner on the market for PTSD, and it's not true. And having been a first responder also, it's like man, how many car wrecks do you have to go to before you've seen enough where it's just like it's at an emotional strain on a psychological and emotional strain on anybody. And that's where we tell these guys and gals, it's like, well, if it wasn't a strain on you, that's where there's a problem. The fact that there is a strain on you just means that you're a human being, and so we find it very therapeutic for veterans to listen to, somebody else that was on there, or even just a mom that had a horrible trauma that was in her life, and all of a sudden it's a sobering experience where people are just like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. This is the human condition, and then we can actually work and learn from each other and show grace and really elevate ourselves through elevating each other. It's a very cool experience.
That's awesome. I've heard a fair bit about cold plunge. Myself personally, I've not done it, although we had a retreat of our own this past weekend, and 13 men that we were with took the cold plunge in the lake to give their life to Messiah, which was beautiful.
Amazing.
Um, yeah, I was in the water for about 90 minutes, honored to be baptizing then. And when I got out, I could not, from the waist down, I couldn't feel anything. I had bricks for legs, but I'm interested if the cold plunge itself, if people are listening at home, if there's benefits to be gained from cold plunge, or if it's the cold plunge in context of the retreats with Mustang medicine, having that conversation and the teaching around IQ, EQ, SQ that really ties it all together.
100%. So you can cold plunge by yourself at home and so you got the physical, psychological, emotional, right? So you can get the physical benefits of cold plunging at home. You can get part of the psychological benefits of cold plunging by yourself. But when you do it as a group with kind of ceremonial intention, like a baptism, right? Like exactly what you're doing, that ties in that psychological emotional side there because we're doing things with an intent in place so that it makes it special. It's a lot more than just going out in my like I have a horse trough and a permanent cold plunge at my house, and when I do it by myself, 100% I'm getting benefits from that, but I'm not getting the same social and emotional benefits is if I do it even with my wife or with my kids, or the ceremonial intent of like at a retreat, or like what you're talking about with a baptism. That just adds so much to the power of what is going on there. Yeah, so it turns it into a very meaningful, cool experience. No pun intended.
I think intent is one of the things that not everybody understands. Maybe most people don't understand intention and attention and how that drives you physiologically, psychologically. We have these existential crisis rectangles that everybody carries around all the time. And,
Love that.
look at it's not my term. I saw it somewhere on the internet and just adopted it. But, we've got these goldfish memory spans instead of this big, beautiful brain that we were given that can like literally work miracles. And but our attention is pointed at all these different things that aren't serving us. And then that's diluting our intention to where maybe it takes getting dunked in something freezing cold to get you to focus in the right here, the right now, and come back to the things that matter rather than what Elon Musk said on X or, scrolling on Instagram.
You're nailing it right there, right? So that's one of the things when we talk about the psychological, right? That is the benefit of cold plunge is because it yanks you into the now.
Mm.
It's you can't really think about, I mean, if you can, God bless you, but you can't really think about anything else when you get into the cold plunge, right? And so two things like so we can use diversion to get our mind off of what's happening, and we tell everybody it's like, hey man, you've already got a black belt in diversion. Don't use that technique. You got that one down in spades. Let's focus on your breathing. Let's focus on the air that's going all the way to the bottom of your lungs as it swirls around your sinuses. Let's think about your body and what you're experiencing. And so that intention, exactly what you're saying, is when you go in, it's okay, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? That it's here. What are the feelings and emotions that are coming up? And you almost like with guys, from the community, especially when you say emotions, it's almost like their eyes roll in the back of their head. And the question that I always ask them is like, have you ever felt fear? Now, if they say no, then it's like, okay, then the conversation's over because I know you're lying. And then if they say yes, it's like, well, fear is an emotion. So fear is an emotion that tells you that something you care deeply about is at risk.
Hmm.
Maybe your life, right? So what is that emotion trying to tell you? So we pay attention to fear, right? Because fear is one of those things that it's an emotion, but it's getting us revved up or it's getting us ready for the potential of something that's dangerous, right? If you're a cop and it's midnight and you've pulled over a vehicle that looks a little bit sketchy or whatever, you better have a little bit of fear in there. It doesn't mean that you're not controlling it, but it means that it's like, okay, I need to pay attention because fear initially heightens the senses. That's the cortisol response. And so, what that allows us to do is it gets us tuned up for the situation. That emotion is telling our body and our brain something. So we pay attention to that. Well, why do we ignore the other ones? And the reality is we ignore them at our own deficit and the problems that they ultimately run into. And we see this over and over again with men typically. Women have a lot better handle on this, but what happens is when you go through the process, right, something triggers this emotion that happens, right? So you have that emotion, and from that emotion, one of three basic things can happen. You have this something triggers this emotion. So biochemicals drive emotions that drive behavior, right? So we have this emotion. That emotion derives like a big emotion, and I start
Hmm.
yelling, screaming, and whatever, and I get upset and I get angry, and I go right back to I didn't learn anything. Or I can get curious, or if I'm a typical guy, right? What I do is I compartmentalize, which is just a fancy way of saying I ignore it, right? And then what we see over time is think of every one of those emotions that are compartmentalized. And this doesn't mean you have to start crying like a blubbering idiot. What it means is you're recognizing and seeing what that message is to your body. But if we ignore it, that message will lay dormant, just like text messages that build up in your phone. And those are like bricks. Well, underneath this platform of bricks, you're holding it up. And we see this with guys and gals that have been holding up this stack of bricks for 10, 15 years longer. And all of a sudden, what happens is the weight of the bricks is just crushing them. And the very thing that they were trying to control ends up controlling them. And so
Hmm.
that's what we do at the retreat is one, we help people get ahead of that, right? For helping them to understand and control their emotions and regulate the nervous system. And then two, help people to understand and read those feelings that lead to emotions, because the feelings are that chemical process, right? That's leading to the emotions that the message that our body's trying to tell us.
100%. I'm not as studied in this as you are, but I tell people that emotions are biomechanical feedback mechanisms, right? And
Mhm.
so it's like an indicator light, like a check engine light. Hey, this thing's important. You should pay attention to it. And then if you don't, you're right. If you don't do anything about the check engine light, it's just a matter of time before you're on the side of the road, or maybe something catastrophic happens. The engine blows.
You
So,
you got it. Yeah. And so the example that we like to see is going back to kind of like when you were talking about the cell phone, right? When the cell phone goes ding, you know there's a message that's there, but until you read the message, you don't know what the message is, right? And so the ding represents the feeling. And so the
mm,
example I like to tell people is, have you ever ridden a roller coaster? Sure. Have you ever had a tense discussion with a boss? Yeah. Did you have butterflies both times? Yes. Same feeling, different message. So
Mm.
you don't know what that message is until you get in there and you read it. So with your cell phone, the ding goes off, and that then tells you, okay, there's a message, butterflies, right? Midnight, and I'm pulling over a sketchy car, right? I got a little bit of butterflies. Okay. What is that emotion that's popping up? Fear. Okay, why? And so then we can dig deeper, right? And so that's that curiosity that I was talking about, where we can start to peel the onion. Why am I feeling that? And so it's like the more that I'm in healthcare, as a as a nurse and the more that I study psychology, the more that I learn where it's like, well, okay, 80% of the diagnosis for your patient comes out of their mouth. Your patient, your patient, and I heard this from a cardiologist. Your patient will tell you what's wrong. And so it's up to you to kind of, as the subject matter expert, to kind of categorize where that's at, whether that's a nursing diagnosis or a diagnosis of whatever it is from the doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist. So what that means though is when fear midnight, right? And I'm pulling over, okay, I have fear. That is my body trying to tell me something. I better pay attention. And so if I start paying attention because my intuition is telling me there's something that's not right here. If you've ever read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, it's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal book on several different instances of this very thing where people knew stuff, but they didn't know why they knew it. But they just had a feeling that was there, and they're like, I don't know why this is wrong, but it's wrong. But if we learn to listen to ourselves, and this is the main thrust of what we teach at Mustang Medicine is if you learn to listen to yourself, man, your body wants to survive. Your body wants to protect you. Your body wants you to be well and to be healed. And it's all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay. And then we can use that as a guide throughout our life, really, to that we can start making the smart and healthy decisions that we need.
Does maybe labeling, I know I'm not a huge fan of labels, but a lot of people use labels to categorize certain actions, behaviors, thoughts, right?
Yeah.
Uh, is there utility in labeling it intuition rather than feeling when you're working with a lot of guys like what you used to work with? Like for
Mhm.
example, I'm an ENTJ, right? And so I'm intuitive, extroverted intuitive judging. And I struggle with the J because everything else is like a foot tall. The J is like 43 feet tall on a billboard. And so I really have to turn the volume down on that and try and operate in humility that I'm not passing judgment on people because they made a mistake or they did a thing that I didn't like when I do that all the time, right? Like I'm the worst offender. Like Paul said, I'm the chief of sinners, right? But I heard somebody explain intuition once as intuition is your brain knowing something that your mouth can't articulate, right? Like you've received all the data and you know from looking at this problem set, something's wrong here, but I can't quite explain why it's wrong.
Mhm.
Is there a difference between intuition and feeling, or are they the kind of the same thing but with different labels?
Based off of the way that you just described it, no, I would say that that's exactly the same thing because we know biochemicals drive emotions that drive behavior,
Hmm.
right? There's a biomechanical, and this has been shown in the literature, there's a biomechanical response that starts because of something, typically because of a thought that we had or some type of stimulus comes in. That biochemical response, maybe it's dopamine, maybe it's endorphins, maybe it's serotonin, maybe it's oxytocin, maybe it's cortisol, right? That chemical response is then driving an emotion. So if it's oxytocin, all of a sudden I start feeling love and I start feeling like I belong. So because I'm in a community where I'm seen, heard, and known, and the oxytocin is flowing, this is what happens with a mother when with her kids. This is why anybody who has kids knows that when a kid stubs their toe and they're a little kid, they don't want to see dad, they want to see mom. Like as a dad, you go there and you're like, oh, what's wrong? And they're like, bah, I don't want to talk to you. Where's mom? This is why the kid that walks across the stage um, and gets his diploma says, thanks, mom. doesn't say that's oxytocin. Cortisol is the fear or the anger or whatever that is. So that's that biochemical that's driving that behavior, right? So then it's like, oh, okay, well, if we're out of balance, then how do we change our biochemicals, right? And that's the next question and then it's like, well, we change our biochemicals by changing our behavior. Change your behavior, change your biochemicals, change your emotion, change your behavior, hopefully to something that's positive. So then it goes down the rabbit hole. Well, okay, how do you change your behavior? And the best that we've been able to figure out is you make reasonable and rational decisions that feel good and right.
Mm.
Then changes the biochemicals, the emotions, and then ultimately the behavior to what we call positive patterns. So, and it's reasonable and rational decisions that feel good and right. So, reasonable and rational is great, but it can't stand on its own because there's plenty of things that are reasonable and rational that ain't good and ain't right, right? We can have a super efficient society, reasonable and rational, but I mean, Nazi Germany is the example. I like to say super efficient, not good, not right. But on the flip side, right? So we can have feels good and right without reasonable and rational. Well, that's the flip side, right? Because we can't go through life and it's just like one continuing rave because we're not getting anything. It's like, or Woodstock. Woodstock was great for a day, but not for the rest of your life. So it's got to be those two so that you can change those biochemicals, change the emotions, change the behavior to something. And this is how we form habits, right? So this is habit forming, and these are the rituals that we do in the morning that help rewrite the neural pathways in our brains and in our bodies and those emotional pathways so that we then elevate ourselves. And hopefully, if we're doing things as best as we can, we elevate those that are around us.
This is brilliant. Uh, I've already got a page of notes. Thank you. And when we spoke on the phone, I had mentioned connecting you with Dr. Trevor Wilkins, and I need to do that. He's my buddy at Thin Line Therapy because a lot of what you're saying and what he's saying, the overlap there is just it's gorgeous. Um, Let me shift gears on you a little bit with a very basic question. With all the medical knowledge that you have, there's disagreement here in my workspace about what color your pee should be. So, what color should your pee be?
That's a great question. And I tend to gravitate towards Timothy Noakes, Dr. Noakes. He's a South African research scientist. Are you familiar with him?
I'm familiar with his name, not much of his works though.
He's phenomenal. He wrote a book that was called Waterlogged, and it's all about the hydration levels of where we are as human beings. He talks about much of the literature that was out there is a little bit skewed when it comes to hydration, but he was going out and he did a long study on what core temperatures of runners and bicyclists can be and urine and trying to figure out where heat cramps were coming from, as well as the optimal hydration level, because he's predominantly in the sports research area. I'll summarize his book. I encourage anybody to read his book. It's phenomenal. He actually has a couple of books. The coolest thing about Noakes is he wrote a book way back in the early 90s called The Lore of Running. And I watched a TED Talk. He was very famous for that book. And then I watched a TED Talk where he got up and he said, "Yeah, about half that book we now know is wrong." He was like, "There's about half that's good," but he was like, "We now know that a lot of the stuff that we said that we were teaching people he's like, it's absolutely wrong." And in subsequent stuff, and any scientist that will get up and go, "Hey man, I was wrong," is somebody that I'll be like, "Okay, this guy can admit that it's like we're constantly learning new stuff, new epiphanal moments, new things come to light." And being willing to change. I think there's a quote that's often attributed to Einstein that says, um, "The geniuses of the future are those that can learn, unlearn, and then learn again." And so, because things are always changing, we're finding out new things, and things that were hardcore laws are all of a sudden not so much. And we see that in medical training, right? And so back in the 80s and the 90s, if you had somebody that was bleeding out, the first thing you did was two large bore IVs and you bolus the bags. Well, oh my goodness. That was a horrible idea. We don't do that anymore. And there's several other things that's like that. It's not malfeasance, it's not, we're not doing that because we're evil human beings or anything. We're doing the best we could. So bringing this full cycle based off of Noakes, who I tend to gravitate towards. The reality is, he said that the only reliable indicator of thirst, or excuse me, the only reliable indicator of hydration is thirst. If
Mm,
you're thirsty, drink. He said the whole thing about the color of your urine, he said it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny when they were testing it in the lab. And then one of my own observations that I made since that time, as I kind of sat and marinated and pondered on that, if you think about mammals, especially predators, when they're out and they walk around, you take your dog out for a walk, what's he doing? He pees, right? Well, when he
yep.
pees, what's he doing? He's marking his territory. So when wolves and bears and everything else are walking around, they're sniffing because they want to see, hey, am I in another predator's territory? Well, in the evolutionary sense, not that we all came from monkeys or anything like that, I don't believe that, but in the evolutionary sense, everything that our body does is for a reasonable and rational reason. There is a reason. It's not just hapstance. I don't believe that the miracle of the human design is just by hapstance. Everything has a reason. And so if we're peeing to mark our territory, if our pee is diluted,
Mm,
how well are we marking our territory?
that's a great observation. I'd never thought about that before.
So, and I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that that is the de facto, somebody will go, well, then I need to be dehydrated so that I have really smelly pee. And it's like, water is essential. The example I like to tell people is water is essential for life, and too much of it we call drowning, right? So,
Hmm.
all things in life, physical, psychological, emotional, all things in life are on this teeter-totter of balance that we're constantly trying to balance these things back and forth. Cortisol is not a good thing in a day-to-day thing. Cortisol is an essential thing if we're fighting a saber-tooth tiger. So the idea is getting that thing to balance. So hydration, how hydrated should you be? Yeah, you need to drink water. We need to make sure that the water we're drinking isn't full of a bunch of toxins like chlorine or plastics or whatever else that people keep finding in the stuff. So is that contributing to the dehydration and the detoxification of the body? Blah, blah, blah. You can run down these rabbit holes, right? So
So, speaking of evolving medicine, can you tell me how you came up with the rats
yeah,
so that I can just get it out there on the record and maybe not push back against the narrative that I was getting, but let's just get the story right, straight from the horse's mouth.
sure, yeah. So there I was, right? And so I was in southern Afghanistan, and we were actually, this is kind of how the story starts, right? So usually there's a problem that gets identified, and then we look for solutions to the problem, right? So we get these friction points or pain or trauma in our life, and we try to figure out solutions, right? We try to figure out, what it is that how we can keep that from happening again, right? So it's the kind of the villain versus the superhero thing in Marvel Comics. Not calling myself a superhero by any stretch of the imagination.
It's the balance.
It's the
It's
balance.
there was an unbalance and you were trying to right the balance.
Exactly, right? So the villain says, the world's going to pay for what happened to me. The hero says, I'm going to make sure that nobody else in the world suffers the way that I did, type thing. So it's finding that positivity in a traumatic experience. So, anyways, I was in southern Afghanistan, and we were walking up a road, and we were doing an assault on a compound. I was in special operations. I was part of a counter-terrorist team. And it was a real small group of Americans, and then we had our indigenous force that were there, of guys that were our our trained guys. They weren't the typical Afghan forces um, that everybody else was working with. So, anyways, we're walking up, and there's a dirt road, and it's interesting the things that you kind of remember, right? So, as you know, as a police officer and infantryman, right? You're constantly playing this game in your head. If we get hit now, I can go here. If we get hit now, I can hide here. If I can get here. And we were walking along and there's this big canal to the right. And I was like, okay, if we get hit, I can't go into this canal because it was super steep and deep. So anyways, we get up to the compound. In Afghanistan, these compounds were like they were compounds. They had 12, 14-foot high walls that were about 3 feet thick, and it was a big steel gate that was on the front. Well, this one we walked up to it, and right next to it there was this ditch, and like a drainage ditch. And I remember thinking it was like, okay, if we get hit, I can get in this ditch for cover. So we're right there and at the compound, and so the ladders go up, and as the ladders are going up, um, our breachers move up to the gate because what we'd do is we'd put explosive charges on the gate and blow the gate, and then we would flood into the compound, and we had a system that we'd use. So this night we were going after the intelligence has told us 1 to 2 Al Qaeda fighters. So it's like, okay, these guys have been murdering Americans out on the with IEDs and stuff like that. And so anyways, the ladders go up so they can see into the compound, and the breachers, 2 guys, are putting charges up on the door. Well, we had gotten compromised at some point, and one of the Al Qaeda fighters inside the compound, it's like a box, right? And so there's a courtyard in the middle. He runs out of the rooms into the middle of the courtyard, and he's got an AK, and he's gone, full auto on the gate. And so he's hammering bullets through the gate. So of course the 2 dudes standing in front of the gate with the explosive charges, they get hit in the legs. So now the fight's on and whatnot. So we jumped up, grab these dudes and drug them down into the ditch where we were at. And it was one of those moments where I was like, wow, that stuff about identifying where you can hide it actually it's like you have these weird snapshot moments and in stressful things. And I remember thinking, I was like, wow, that actually worked. And then I was the ground force commander, and so I'm helping to direct the fight. Turned out there were like 4 Al Qaeda guys that were on the inside. So, anyways, we've got these 2 wounded guys. So it's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're wearing night vision goggles, black gloves, dark uniforms, and the tourniquet that we have, and I never say what type of tourniquet we had, but tourniquet we had was black because for some reason everything in a tactical setting's got to be black, which is kind of ridiculous. But and so I at one point I looked down and my medics, who were actually very well trained, but they're Afghan, right? And so they're kind of fumbling with the tourniquet as they're trying to put it on. And so it was just kind of one of those weird snapshot moments where it was like, huh, okay, that's interesting. And then we were back into the fight. And then later on, the fight was over, right? And so we're calling in medevac for these guys. And they've got tourniquets on both legs because they've been hit in both of them in both their legs. So we're one of the guys is trying to pull the tourniquet off because his skin had gotten pulled up into the tourniquet. And so and then later on when he came back to camp, he had like a black bruise about that big where the skin had gotten pulled up in the area. So anyway, so fast forward, I'd go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I'd come home, and when I would come home, a lot of times what I'd do is I would train Americans in close quarter battle. So I'd go home and I'd do the academic, and then I'd go back and put everything in practice, and then go home and do the academic and go back and do the practice. So, anyways, at this point, I was at a training facility out in Arkansas by the name of Direct Action Resource Center. Phenomenal place for learning team close quarter battle. In my opinion, probably the best place, period, to learn this stuff. And so it's a very high stress because we'd shoot thousands of simunition rounds. In sims, if you've ever been shot with sims, hurt. And so I was up on the catwalk and we were training some pararescue men and some PJs. And because their PJs were like, hey, we're yelling down from the catwalk. Your buddy's hit, put a tourniquet on there. You're hitting the arm, put a tourniquet on your arm. So we're inducing casualties. So they're wearing protective masks to protect their face, but it also helped to mimic tunnel vision, sympathetic response under stress, and increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, because it's a little bit harder to breathe in a
Hmm.
protective mask. So the protective mask was there as a way to protect you, but it was also a way to artificially induce the same conditions that you feel under stress, right? So tunnel vision, increased heart rate, increased. So, anyways, I'm sitting up on the catwalk and I look down and I'm seeing these PJs. PJs are incredibly trained trauma medics, right? And I'm seeing, so it's night, NVGs, black gloves, black tourniquet. And I look down and I see these PJs, these fumbling with the tourniquet the same exact way that my guys had been fumbling with it. And it was that moment where I was like, whoa, this isn't a training issue. This is a design issue. And
Mm.
so then I was like, well, we need to find something else for our endage over in Afghanistan because they don't have it's like they're not getting the same level of training, obviously, as like American PJs. I mean, they're getting really good training, but it's just not the same. And so I was like, well, there's got to be something else that's out there. Well, tourniquets were actually pretty new back then. And there was still a lot of the urban myths. It used to be like tourniquet at last resort, and you're going to lose the limb, and all of these wives' tales that we now know is like absolutely urban myths, not true, that dated all the way back, based off of my research, dated all the way back to the Civil War, where guys would get shot in the arm or the leg. They'd put a tourniquet on them, they'd go in the barn, and then they would leave the barn missing that limb with people going, well, you're going to lose the limb, forgetting that like a vascular surgeon flat out did not exist back in the 1860s. They just your best chance to survive, never mind infection and all that other stuff.
Yeah, cleavers and bone saws. You know,
Cleavers and bone saws, yeah, doing the
that, that
best to save these guys' lives.
that's one of the things that we teach in our classes at Refuge is, taking data from COTC and presenting that in a civilian format is that people aren't losing limbs because of tourniquets. They're losing limbs because of the injuries that required the tourniquets to try and demystify that entire thing. But please continue.
Yeah, there's actually a great study. Remind me, I'll send it to you. There were thousands of tourniquet applications. DoD did a study, thousands of tourniquet applications, not one instance of losing a limb due to tourniquet use, not one.
Yep.
And so it is arguably the safest, most effective means of stopping massive hemorrhage. And massive hemorrhage is the most preventable cause of death, most preventable cause of death on the battlefield as well as in the civilian world. And so it's like I'll ask people, how many of you guys have been in a gunfight? And it's like maybe one or two hands go up. And it's like, how many of you guys have driven past a car wreck? Well, everybody raised their hand. It's like, well, there you go. You should probably carry a tourniquet before you do the other. So, anyways, I digress. So I was looking for a solution that was easy, that didn't have the required as heavy of a skill set that was required for that, and so couldn't find anything. And I was like, and there's actually there's quite a few great tourniquets out on the market now, but I couldn't find anything, and so it was like, okay, and so I started down, typical cocky SF guy. I was like, well, I'm going to come up with something, I'm going to come up with something better, and so I started working on, and actually two patents that came out of this. One is a tourniquet that is built into a belt system, and it's so stupid simple. I can't believe nobody else thought of it. And then the other one was the rat, and so it was prototype number 26, as I recall, is what happened with the rat. And the thing that really was the pivotal point for me as I was watching TV one night and there was a show on and there was this little girl had a rubber band and she was wrapping the rubber band around her finger and her finger, we've all done this as kids, right? And her finger turned purple. And I was like, wait a minute, that's cutting off the blood flow to that finger. So why can't I make up the width, the inch and a half to 2 inches? Why can't I make that up in circumferential wraps?
Hmm.
And so I started looking and it was like, can I do this? And I found a study first I found a study from the Canadians where they had tested surgical tubing, straight surgical tubing. And the tourniquet that did the best out of the other ones that they were looking at was the surgical tubing. And then I looked at the references that they had pulled from. And in World War II, there was a surgeon who was a huge advocate. He was like, we have got to start issuing surgical tubing to these soldiers on the battlefield because we are losing them because you have about 5 liters of blood in your system. Well, if you lose 2.5 liters, you're gonna there's a good chance you're gonna expire. And we know this because in the early days of the war, guys were getting injured on the battlefield. And then they were using pressure points and pressure bandages and stuff. They were making it all the way back to Landstuhl, Germany, and still expiring because they were going into hepatic failure. So the toxins had built up, and then all of a sudden it'd flush, and then boom, it was hitting the liver, and boom, it was wiping them out. And so AMED came out and said, we have got to start using tourniquets. Same old pushback came in where it was like, yeah, but they're going to lose limbs and they're going to get gangrene. And they were like, these guys are dying. We have to preserve every drop of blood. And that's when we started figuring out it's like, oh, large bore IVs and all that other stuff. Medicine changed a lot in 2002 and with the invasion of Afghanistan, and then even more so 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. If surgical tubing works and whatnot, so I started doing prototypes and having worked a lot with explosives, anybody that's worked with explosives, when you tie in, you have a det cord loop that you go to the pigtail that then you have like a red devil, which is a little plastic piece that slides on so that you can tie your detonation system into the actual charge to set it off. So the early rats were actually red devils that I was making out of like chem lights and stuff. Well, that was a little bit bulky, and it's like as you can imagine, like this design got super complicated, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm never gonna make it." And I was a combat diver in special forces, and so it was like all of a sudden I was on a dock, and I looked down, I saw a cleat, and I was like, "Well, wait a minute, why can't I just use a cleat? I mean, cleats have been around for thousands of years. Let's try it." So I tried it, and then I put the notches in, and as they say, the rest is history. And then I presented this because I was just looking for a solution, and then it kind of I I licensed it out to another company, and then after I retired and stuff, I was like, well, I'm gonna take this thing back. It was kind of struggling a little bit, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. And by then, the education of the public had come full circle, and people had realized, oh yeah, tourniquets are actually they're actually very, very safe and effective. And so with mine, because the skill degradation, and I've talked to so many people that they're like, man, I didn't remember how to put that thing on. I just wrapped it really tight, and I don't advocate this one bit, but I talked to a police officer, and they were like, yeah, I just put it on tight and saved this guy's life from an arm. And it's been really meaningful and humbling. I mean, we at this point there's hundreds of saves. And it's been just so incredibly meaningful that these people will get hold of me and they'll tell me that's like, I mean, I had one guy that saved his dad's life, and it's like, how do you put a value on that? I mean, it's like I've got
Priceless.
a guy
It's
on this,
priceless.
and his dad fell out of a tree stand and shoved his, tib fib through the side of his foot, and his dad was on Coumadin blood thinners. And he ran out there, and he thought his dad was getting attacked by a bear, so he left the first aid kit, ran out there. Just so happened he had this tourniquet on and saved his dad's life. My nephew, I mean, you want to talk about meaningful moments. my nephew 2 years ago saved a kid's life. He works at a scout camp, and a kid had a glancing blow from an axe, came back, sliced the artery in his lower leg, and he put the tourniquet on. And it was an hour and a half plus to get them on a rough road to get this guy to a hospital. Kid saying, "Hey, this hurts. Can you take it off?" Dad is leaning on my nephew, who's, 25, 23, 25. And he's like, he was like, I remember Uncle Jeff saying, once the tourniquet goes on, it never comes off. And he's like, so I resisted the pressure from the dad. They got to the hospital. The hospital took the tourniquet off. It was rotating nurses trying to hold pressure to stop the bleed. Couldn't stop the bleed, put a tourniquet back on to stop the bleed so the vascular surgeon could get in there and stitch that artery back together. And the doc was like, you saved that kid's life. And it's like, it's interesting. Very few of our saves are actually have anything to do with violence. It's just the weirdest, strange accidents that people run into, like almost on a daily basis. We had a guy riding a motorcycle that harpooned his leg with a stick that was on the trail, and another guy that walked into a broadhead arrow that harpooned himself like a punji steak. It was just laying in the grass. Nobody shot him. It was just probably an arrow that had missed or something was laying. And it's just on and on and on and on these stories. And so it's been incredibly humbling. And at the height of, years ago when I was getting beat up on social media and stuff, and then these stories, I'd get another story and it'd be like, okay, it's worth it. I can take a few more hits or a bunch more hits, go another round in the ring because somebody just called me and said, "Hey, man, I just saved my neighbor's life, or I just saved my own life on the thing." So it's been incredibly meaningful.
I really appreciate your honesty and vulnerability with that. And thank you for sharing that because I don't think the industry at large has shared any of those stories. And as I've said, I've had somebody in the industry came to me and fed me a ration of bullshit about your product, and then I messed up by repeating that without having ever come to you. Um, and so that's totally my bad. I think the saves for me is like that's what keeps us coming back to work here. The economy's not been friendly the last few years, and
Mm.
predominantly working in the civilian market, when people have to pick and choose between groceries and a mortgage or buying a first aid kit, buying a tourniquet, I don't blame them for buying groceries, paying the mortgage, making sure the kids have shoes. Um, but it's when you get those stories of, predominantly motor vehicle accidents, freak accidents, workplace injuries. A guy falls off a ladder and lands on something. He's got, something stuck through his arm or stuck through his leg. Had a guy got his arm ripped off by a skid steer at work. Just freak accidents.
Oh.
So thank you for doing what you do. And I've got a couple more questions for you. Then I'll with your blessing, let you get back to your day. The first question is, what should normies, civilians who are interested in this stuff do for continuing education beyond Stop the Bleed? If they're really passionate, because you clearly know your stuff, you've been in this for a long time. Where would you direct your average soccer mom, bus driver, dad? Where should they be going to look for more continuing education?
That's a great question. And I would, there's so many quality instructors that are out there. So just do a little bit of homework. I will say this, you can go to private classes. I mean, it's always like CPR is a lifesaver. Knowing the Heimlich maneuver, just getting your CPR and first aid card from, I mean, Gemini, from the American Red Cross or some of these other places, it's there. God forbid something happens to your kid, and it's like, oh my gosh, if I'd spent 5 minutes watching a YouTube video, I maybe could have saved somebody else's child or my own. And so these are the things, like as a former team sergeant, right? It's one of those things where it's like, did I do everything that I could do to keep from happening, keep bad stuff from happening? And so for me, like, I mean, I'm a disabled veteran, but I don't claim to have PTSD, and that's not because I'm like some badass or something like that. Because it's like I could look in the mirror and say I constantly was fueled on learning as much as I could, training as much as I could, motivating my guys to get out and train as much as they could, so that then, for my lifespan, the 13 years I was in the CT unit, that's like when bad stuff happened, it was like I know that I did everything in my power that I could do. And so for people that are learning it, and it's like, so what's the litmus test of somebody that's training? And I would say, look, they don't have to be like a special forces guy, and they don't have to be like a 30-year firefighter. I mean, that may be a great place, but I mean, it would be like, look at the reviews. But I'd also say look at what they teach. So when I teach first responder stuff, I have a bag of tourniquets. I've got, I think it's probably 20, 25 different tourniquets from around the world. And I teach field expedient tourniquets because it's not as intuitive as a lot of people like to think. It's easy once you see it, right? But it's not as intuitive as people like to think. Because I look at it when I teach people, I just want to help people. So I could just teach the rats because it's like I think this is the best and blah 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 blah. Yeah, but that may not be what's on scene. That may not be what's in that first aid kit. That may not be the one that you have. That may not be available, and all of a sudden I'm using a t-shirt and a stick so that I can stop somebody from hemorrhaging out. So what's the proper way to do that? So I would say something to look for is somebody that's got experience in the area, but then also somebody that's teaching a well-rounded thing. If they're just teaching one thing, I'd be like, okay, there's plenty of good people that are out there that do that, but I would ask for more because for me, like the world according to Jeff, right? That is the responsible thing to do, right? It's great to have a pressure dressing, but if all I have is a t-shirt, does that mean I stand there with my hands in my pockets waiting for the ambulance? No, that doesn't feel good or right, nor is it reasonable and rational. It's like I need to do what it is that I can do. And if I know the basis of what that is, because a little bit is a lot when we start talking about, trauma.
So that's something as far as field expedient tourniquets and the wide world of tourniquets. That's something at Refuge that we've done in our higher level classes that I'm going to start moving down to our basic level classes. And that came out of our first conversation on the phone. So I thank you for that because you're absolutely correct. Just because I carry a cat or I carry a soft tea or I carry a rat doesn't mean that's what's going to be there. And I've got two tourniquets on me right now because I'm me, but the average person out there has zero. And so who knows what they're going to run into. So
Right.
I agree with that completely. I think that it makes a lot of sense. So we're moving that from our 2 day class down to our standard 3 to 4 hour class
Mhm.
for those reasons. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like you don't have to have an Asherman chest seal, right? A Ziploc bag and a hand holding it will still, be an occlusive dressing on somebody who's got a punctured lung, right? As long as it's penetrating wound and stuff. But and so somebody that can teach kind of that field expedient stuff in the world of, come from SF, right? It's like make do with what you got. And so we were big on that. And that's what I would look for because, a soccer mom sitting in her kitchen and that doesn't remember where the first aid kit is, and you get the first aid kit and it's full of a whole bunch of band-aids. It's like, well, that's not going to help you very well. It's like I know somebody right now that like 3 days ago, you know, gnarly cut on the hand that all of a sudden I'm getting a phone call. What do I do? And it's pressure. Okay, send me a picture of it. And okay, blah, blah, blah. And away you go. And so it just, when you do that, when you see this, it's not that the field expedient stuff replaces the formally manufactured stuff. That is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is if you have the field expedient and you have that knowledge, then all of a sudden when you don't have it, it's there, but it builds the confidence in the person that's there because it's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm out here in the woods. I don't necessarily have to do it this way. It's like, can you use a belt as a tourniquet? Yeah. I'll tell you right now, it makes a crappy tourniquet. And it's not as simple as wrapping that thing around your leg and twisting on it and stuff like that. We used to have a video on Ready Man where we used a variety of different things, field expedient things for tourniquets, but it's just building that confidence in people.
Love it. The last question I have, and I know that you're not, or at least you've said that you don't get around on socials very much lately and all that. And so, again, I thank you for your time. Where do people find you, find your books, find out more about you? Where should people go if they liked what they've heard? Specifically, I think what you're doing with Mustang Medicine is incredible. So where should people go looking for resources?
So mustangmedicine.com is our site, and then we have a parallel site there that where we have groups of people that are getting together and talking and sharing ideas that's there. Mustang Medicine shows the immersive retreats that we do. And it explains it a little bit. And then we have some ebooks and stuff that we've written that are up on there. And then ReadyMan. So readyman.com. I still have ReadyMan. I've had that for years. It's kind of it's kind of got an emotional attachment to it. And but they can find us on ReadyMan. We do have a Facebook page that's on there. So you can find Ready Man on Facebook, and there's some closed groups. But our books, so the Black Autumn series of books, the 9 series, those are on Ready Man. You can also find them on Amazon as well, and that's Black Autumn. So the movie Homestead by Angel Studios is based off of the Black Autumn series, and so that was incredibly humbling to have your book made into a movie, by the way. So it was surreal. But all that stuff's available on Ready Man. I kind of pulled back. We had our Instagram page and we were exploding, and then the back in the back in the days when censorship was as way more popular than it is now. We had multiple pages deleted, and then after the last page got deleted on Instagram, I was kind of like, I'm in school and I'm getting my master's in psychology and working on advanced practice nursing and still writing books. We've written 4 books for Mustang Medicine. I've got 2 more books in the pipeline. I've got a couple of books that are up on KDP for, that's the author portion on the Ready Man side where it's like Gunspeak 101. We just released that. And then we redid a Special Forces A Camp manual, super, super, super rare manual that went back through and redid all of the drawings and stuff. And if you're a hardcore prepper, I think you'll find it really interesting. If you're just a history buff, I think you'd find it interesting. These Special Forces A camps and Vietnam and how they did that. So so we'll release that here probably hopefully next month or so. But yeah, so we're on Amazon and ReadyMan.com and MustangMedicine.com.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate you. And
Yeah.
what you've accomplished is just it should be inspiring to everybody who's listening. There's an undercurrent here of you just have continued to solve problems. And not everybody does that. A lot of people just roll over and let life beat their ass. And it doesn't sound like that's how you operate. And so that's inspiring to me as somebody that's, we make first aid kits. We're an American manufacturer. We're consistently getting our ass beat and yet still looking for good reasons to show up to work. And your story is one of those good reasons. And I just wanted to thank you for your time.
I'm a firm believer in be the positive in the world, in a world full of so much negativity. And maybe this is the older Jeff, right? I just turned 55, and the thing I like to say is I'm okay, I'm halfway there. What am I going to do with the other half of my life, right? I can tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to carry a gun and, and fight wars and stuff. That's a younger man's game. And so it's like, well, where can I find fulfillment? Where can I find purpose? Where can I continue to build my community and what that is? That's a connected community, and what does that look like? And provide for the people that I love, my family and my friends, and then also it's like and look in the mirror and go, did you do, when I reach the end of the race, right at the end of the line, and you stand before the big man, in the clouds, and it's like, hey man, how did I do? Did I, and the ride is a blast. I'll tell you, probably I went back to nursing school when I was 50 years old, 50, after I'd retired from the 28 years being a Green Beret. And I'll tell you what, it was one of the absolute best things that I ever did. Absolute one of the best things I ever did. And so it's just led to so much more fulfillment on the, just and expanding my brain and all of that. And so I would encourage anybody, it's like, man, if you we live in an incredibly blessed time. It is a miracle of time where you can go to school and you never even have to leave your house. And it's like you can learn anything. And it's like 2 years ago, I was negotiating with a kid in the mountains of Pakistan over bringing in Damascus tomahawks that were just absolutely magnificent that were there. And I gave them out as, but it's like I'm talking to this guy through Facebook. I mean, it's like we live in an amazingly amazing time, and so yeah, yeah, that's me, man. I'm gonna stay positive and drag my community, kicking and screaming out of their negativity and be more positive.
Love it. Thank you, Jeff. Now I have to find the button to hit. There it is.